continuing to get insights from folks outside of the construction industry on how to live your best life as a hard-charging entrepreneur. That is what today's episode's all about. My guest is Kevin Dahlstrom. He is the CEO of Swell, which is a financial services company. But the point of our interview today is how Kevin walked away from $10 million and improved his life. I think you're going to really enjoy this conversation, particularly if you are feeling yourself overwhelmed and stressed out with the way that your life is currently running. Kevin's story is going to present you with some interesting questions and perspectives that might challenge the way that you're doing things at the moment and cause you to consider a different approach to your career and balancing your career with your choices outside of your business life. If you find this interview useful, you can always connect with Kevin on Twitter at Camp4. That's CAMP4. That is where you can connect with Kevin. He's active on Twitter. I really appreciate him coming on the show today. I know you will enjoy this conversation. Thank you for listening to Construction Genius. This is Eric Anderton, and you're listening to Construction Genius, a leadership masterclass. Thomas Edison said that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. If you're a construction leader, you know all about the perspiration, and this show is all about the 1% inspiration that you can add to your hard work to help you to improve your leadership. Kevin, welcome to Construction Genius.
Hey, thanks, Eric. I'm excited to be here.
Tell me about the first job you ever had.
Yeah. So even though I've spent my entire career in technology and finance, actually, your listeners might appreciate that my first job ever at the age of 16 was in construction. I got a summer job for a commercial construction company, and they put me on the demolition crew. And it was an eye-opening experience. You know how construction guys are. They like, when there's a new kid on the job, they like to pull pranks. And so day one, they put me on the jackhammer for 8 hours. I was chipping tile as part of a demolition project. And, I was a skinny 16-year-old kid, had never worked a jackhammer before in my life. After 8 hours on that thing, I went home, and literally the next morning I could barely move. So I kind of shuffle back into the job site the next day. And of course, they're all laughing at me. But it was actually kind of my first win in business, because they said, yeah, we do this to all the new guys. And, about 50% don't even show up the next day. So the lesson I took from that was a big part of success is just showing up, just be consistent, just showing up. You got to show up to claim the prize, right?
That's awesome.
But yeah, just to give a little background for your listeners, that summer was the extent of my experience in construction. I was a math guy as a kid. And so I ended up working in financial services. And over the past 25 years, I've started a bunch of companies, had one that became a big company, did an IPO, but I've also done transformations at larger companies. I've been a C-level executive at 3 different public companies. And so if I have anything unique to offer, it's really just I've seen a lot. I've been running really hard for a long time, and I've seen a lot in business and in my personal life. I've been, super active in my personal life as well.
Let's dive into that a little bit, because I know 98% of my listeners run really hard, and, they've built their companies or they're leading these companies, and construction is a tremendously difficult industry. What have you found are some insights into leaders like yourself who've been able to succeed, even though they're running at a high pace in balancing their life out and making sure that they're not going insane?
Yeah, it's tough. That's the struggle that we all have. And I think, I write a lot on Twitter about, finding that balance. And frankly, I guess I found it fairly late in life, but it was an epiphany for me. So, I guess I'm just wired, like a lot of your listeners, wired to just run hard. I like to win. I'm usually willing to do the hard work to win. But the question is, what game are you winning at? And for me, it was like a one moment that I remember being an epiphany. I was one of the top executives at this multi-billion-dollar financial services company. And I remember distinctly, sitting, and it was in a board meeting, and I think there was me plus 10 other, board members and executives. And I remember just having this moment where I looked around the table, And they were all wildly successful if you measure it just purely on financial measures. But there wasn't a single person who I wanted to emulate. They were all, frankly, physically unhealthy. A lot of them had broken family lives. And that moment was a huge epiphany. And literally, after that day, it was hard for me to even come into the office one more day. I mean, a long story short, I pulled the plug on that job. I'd had most of my career in Texas to that point, pulled the plug on that job and moved my family to Boulder, Colorado, which is where I live now. It wasn't an easy move by any stretch, but man, did it pay off in a huge way, because it was part of a kind of, I guess, a midlife awakening that many of us have around, like, what are your priorities and what does success mean to you?
Well, let's explore that a little bit. You said that you had an epiphany, which, we think of as sort of a moment, and that insight, that visceral insight as you're looking around the room and you're thinking, I don't want to do this, and perhaps I want to do that. Was there a process that you can remember that led to that epiphany, a series of perhaps smaller insights that led to that larger insight?
Yes. And as funny as it may sound, the thing that was the catalyst for all this was rock climbing. So I'm a rock climber. I started rock climbing about 25 years ago. And rock climbing, it changed my life in so many ways, almost all of them positive, because it introduced me to a pursuit where the scoreboard was not dollars, right? And it was this community that I became a part of, where I say to this day, and a lot of people have trouble believing this, but a lot of my best friends come from my climbing pursuits. And many of them don't even know what I do for a living. And frankly, awesome. They don't care, and nor should they. And I love that. So it was just this, I sort of got a glimpse at what the other side looks like. I think a lot of times, especially for men, hard charging men, we start our careers, we charge forward, put our noses down. We wake up one day and we're like, what in the world have I created? Like, this is not what I really wanted. And so for me, rock climbing showed me that there was another part of life to be savored. And so what it was, this big change for me was really about gaining back time, because time is ultimately our most valuable currency.
So it's interesting to think about, because I picture you on the one hand, at the face of a rock, and on the other hand, in that board meeting, and you're associating with two different groups of people. And we are so much formed by the people that we associate with.
Sure.
And I can hear someone perhaps on listening to the podcast saying, Kevin, it's cool that you had that epiphany and you made changes as a result of that, but I'm not quite in that place yet where I know maybe changes need to happen, but I'm not quite there where I want to make the change. What was it that really just pushed you to the point where the epiphany became action and not just the thought or the existential dread that maybe I'm not doing with my life what I'm supposed to be doing?
It was really recalibrating around happiness as the success measure. Honestly, I was in my mid 40s, so it wasn't like it was super early in my life. I realized that the key, at least for me, and I think for most people, to happiness is having what I call a multidimensional life, where, you're not just trying to win on one dimension, and you have these other dimensions in your life are actually competing with each other, but it ends up sort of paradoxically making you better at everything. And I'm going to share something I've actually never said publicly, but this is going to be an interesting soundbite for your listeners. So I walked away from about $20 million to make this change. So just to quantify how important this was to me, I was sort of a made man, if you will. Yep. I had a very clear path. And, so I put my money where my mouth is. And I think that's kind of like, honestly, like a lot of my friends literally said, what the F are you doing? You're crazy. Yep. But, look, I was 45 and we're not going to live forever. Yep. And I wanted to gain control of my time. And I realized doubling or tripling or quadrupling my net worth wasn't going to change my life in a significant way, because a lot of the things that I valued most, I realized really don't cost much or anything.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's very interesting. I've been reading the book of Ecclesiastes from the wisdom literature in the Old Testament, and I read a verse today, and I think you'll like this. It's better to have one handful with quietness than two handfuls with hard work and chasing the wind.
Yeah. There's a lot to be said for this idea of, stillness, quietness, regaining some of that in our lives. I mean, we get used to charging so hard and having every minute of our day be packed. And I just don't think that's at some point that breaks. It's not sustainable forever. And look, I always like to say, like in the early days, for you younger people out there, you do what you have to do to pay the bills and to get ahead. Look, you don't have control over your life when you're young, but you get to be in your 30s, 40s, even 50s. The goal should be to slowly regain more control over your life. And so that more of what you do is things you choose to do rather than things you have to do. So I actually have this notion that's fairly controversial that I think the old retirement paradigm is DOA, like it's dead. This idea that you work your butt off for 65 years and then you suddenly stop and watch TV all day. Yep. That's not a path to happiness. I think it's a spectrum where over time you're doing, like, the majority of your time becomes things that you would choose to do. And I'm 51 now, and I would say that it's never perfect, but over half of the way of my time is spent doing things that I choose to do.
I want to go back to this idea of you walking away from $20 million. How did you reach that point where you were emotionally okay with that? And I'm thinking about this on a number of different levels. Number one, thinking about what other people think about you, because you were around a particular peer group where walking away from $20 million makes you look like a complete fool, right?
True.
Really, like an idiot, insane.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, you do have, the sense that we have, all of us in our lives, that I have responsibilities to others. So for instance, going through that conversation with your family about what that means, how did you negotiate both the perception of other people and also the practical impact of that decision to walk away from the 20 mil?
Well, like I said, it means putting your money where your mouth is. It's one thing to say, oh, I don't care about status, I'm not chasing dollars. But it's another thing to actually make hard decisions that reflect those values. And look, I'm not a monk. I mean, I'm a hardcore capitalist. I just started at a company and raised $10 million. It's a venture-backed technology startup. I want to create $1 billion company. I still run really hard, but it was really about doing things on my terms. And really that epiphany for me, that was very insightful of you to point out that epiphany was probably the culmination of a long process where slowly I realized that chasing more status, chasing more money wasn't going to make me happier. What was going to make me happier was living in a place that inspired me, having time to spend with my family, traveling, rock climbing, investing in my relationships outside of work. Those were the things. And look, one thing we all share is we have roughly the same amount of time on this planet. Yep. There's this concept that people call the time billionaire.
Yes.
It's a litmus test for people because you say, okay, you go to a 30-year-old and you say, look, you've got about 1 billion seconds left to live in your life. Would you trade those billion seconds to be Warren Buffett and be 95 years old, worth however many billions he's worth? Would you trade places? And most people would say no. Then if you believe that, then the answer is, okay, that means you're already more wealthy than Warren Buffett because you've got time. How are you going to use that time?
Yeah, that's interesting. How did that conversation go with your wife? I'm just curious. When the epiphany became action, it wasn't just, it was something that perhaps was working inside of you and then it came out in conversation and then in decision.
Yeah. Well, see, so my wife, it was a tough discussion because I basically blew up her life. I blew up my kids' lives. I guess, there's levels of blowing up lives.
Totally. No, believe me, there are levels.
I basically forced a move that really nobody else asked for. But, my wife and kids had a very different perspective because they weren't living my reality every day. My wife enthusiastically supported me, changing my life to find more happiness and fulfillment. Part of that ended up being that I needed to move. I just needed to be somewhere more inspiring. I needed to be closer to the people that I connect with. That was the hard part. And frankly, I had to force the move. The good news is now, a little like 4.5 years later, and in fact, I just asked my wife this the other day and I said, be honest, like, would you still rather in Texas? And she said, no, now that we're settled in here, I see, Boulder sells itself and I'm happy to be here. So, and I think my kids would say the same thing.
Interesting. You made a macro decision, but you've also spoken on Twitter to some of the micro decisions that you've made. When I say micro, smaller ones. And one of them particularly that interested me, particularly because I've just gone through this process myself, is the purchase of a car. Yeah. And so tell us about the car that you purchased and the decision-making process that went around that.
Yeah. So this is a funny story because it was something I wrote on Twitter and apparently it hit a nerve with a lot of people because
believe me, it's a good one.
Kind of took off. So yeah, this was probably, 10 years ago. I had a really big financial win. And, I've always been like, I'm not a big spender. Like we've always lived well below our means. I don't have fancy things, but since I was 12 years old, I'd always had an obsession with the Porsche 911. I think it's just the most beautiful car ever designed. I had posters of it on my wall growing up. And I had this big financial win. I was like, you know what? I'm going to go buy a Porsche 911. So I went to the dealership. I bought the top of the line Porsche 911. It's the Turbo S convertible. It was gorgeous. I actually posted a picture of the exact car online. And I paid cash for it, and it wasn't a stretch at all. I mean, it was literally just a check I could write easily. And I get it home that night, and I'm laying in bed, and this car is already causing me stress. I'm just like, gosh, now I have to maintain this thing. I have to keep it clean. And is it going to be my daily driver, or do I want to keep miles down? And what I realized very quickly is I wasn't that 13-year-old boy anymore with posters of the 911 on the wall. What the 911 represented to me back then, which was like the pinnacle of success, my definition of success had changed. And part of my definition of success now is actually less. Less is more, less things, less stress. And so long story short, I took that car back to the dealer the next day and I said, hey man, this car is freaking amazing, but it's just not for me. And to the manager's credit, he said, you know what? You're the first person that's ever done that. Let me shake your hand and we'll take the car back. And so they tore up my check. And that was just, I think, another sort of put your money where your mouth is. If you're going to live these principles, you got to really live them. And so, to cut to the end now, so I still drive my same, 14-year-old truck with 160,000 miles on it.
Beautiful.
And I love that car. It makes me so happy.
That's beautiful. So interesting. Anyway, I think what's interesting here, this is what I'm hearing, is that our definition of success and happiness comes from our identity.
That's right.
And it sounds like over time, your identity has changed.
Yeah. And I think, look, I was always probably built a little bit. I had a rough upbringing. I grew up in a very non-traditional, chaotic household, family members in prison, addiction issues, all this. So I was probably a little bit different all along. But I think you nailed it, Eric, is really what we're talking about is identity. And I think the risk that maybe a lot of your listeners will face, like, let's say you own a construction company, you've had some success, probably a huge portion of your identity is wrapped up in that business.
Absolutely.
But I'm here to tell you that's not enough long-term to sustain happiness. And so what happens is you'll get older and older, and your identity is so wrapped up in your business that you have nothing else. In fact, I have a great story for that. One of the CEOs of one of the public companies I worked with pulled me aside one day and he said, hey man, what are you doing? Because you seem to be a lot happier than me. And look, I've had all this success. I'm worth, 9 figures. But I'm kind of miserable, Kevin. And when I dug into it, it turns out like literally he had nothing other than work. His identity was 100% wrapped up in his work. His family situation wasn't great. He didn't have any hobbies or external interests. And, his work career was sort of coming to an end, and so he was like, what do I do for the next 30 years? I got nothing.
Yep. Yeah. It's so interesting because you can spend your whole life acquiring or succeeding, quote unquote. And at the end of it, you can look back on it and say, what did it all really mean? That's
right. I mean, ultimately, not to get too existential.
No, it's fine. Get existential. We're good.
We're
good.
We're all here to find, meaning is what we're all searching for. Now, right. Why are we on this rock hurtling around in space? What's the point of it all? And, I decided, and I think others, have kind of gone on the same journey, is that ultimately the only things we have are relationships and experiences. Right. And the reality is the best of both of those things cost nothing.
Yeah, and that's so true. Now let's talk about this idea of multi-dimensions, because you talked at the beginning about perhaps these competing dimensions of your life, and yet as they come together, you find a synergy in those dimensions. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I'll give you a simple example, and I may even drop a curse word if that's okay.
Construction, so it's completely okay.
Yeah, I figured it would be. So a simple example of that is, I love working with multidimensional people because I always say they always have something better to be doing. Simple example is like, let's say you're sitting in a meeting. The people with multidimensional lives are ruthlessly efficient. They're like, let's get this meeting done because I want to get the fuck out of here.
Yep.
Like they have other things to be doing.
Yep.
And so like, if you think about, if you're multidimensional, let's say you've got your work, you're really dedicated to your family and you're trying to build that. You've got friendships outside of work. You've got a hobby or a pursuit. like your calendar's full. So you have to be ruthless with your time. And so you can start to see though, how that actually becomes sort of synergistic, because not only do you have to be ruthlessly efficient, which is good for everything, but there's also bleed over in terms of like the learnings and the skills and the insights and the inspiration that comes from these different dimensions. So as an example, I've been a marketing guy most of my career, so it's probably on the extreme. Is a lot of my work is creative. I've had some of my best ideas while rock climbing. Well, are you going to call that work or is that not work? What is that? I don't know. It's all the same thing.
Yeah. I like that. It's interesting. So think about it as you're building, you have your startup. Your startup is it Swell?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. As you're building that and you're working with perhaps younger people who are at a different point in the journey of life, how do you communicate this epiphany to them in such a way so that they're able to achieve what they want to achieve and yet perhaps not get into some of the traps that you got into as you were building your career?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. And as you know, Eric, some things you have to learn the hard way, unfortunately, no matter how good the advice you get is. So hopefully, it helps a little bit, but ultimately, I think we all have to go on our own journey. And just for your listeners, I'm not going to talk much about my company Swell because it's not related in any way to what most of your listeners do. But think of Swell as it's a new financial app that replaces your old-fashioned bank account. And it does the things that banks should have been doing all along to really help you get ahead with your money, help you really build wealth. And it's especially important for younger people who are just beginning that journey. But in many ways, Swell is the manifestation of everything I believe, because we're building Swell really as money is just a means to live a great life. That's the way it should be framed for everybody. Right. You should be doing smart things with your money, but really only as a means to live a great life, which sometimes takes money, sometimes doesn't. And so what we're really trying to create with the Swell brand is almost a lifestyle, to your point about how do you convey some of these lessons through your work, through Swell. The way we do that is we're really building the ultimate win for Swell is that it gets viewed as a lifestyle where it's like, okay, I'm using, this replaces my bank for all the basic stuff I need, checking and savings and loans and all that stuff. But also I know that everything that Swell does is done with an eye toward helping me just live a happier, healthier life.
Yep.
And so I subscribe to that brand ethos. That's what ultimately will drive loyal long-term customers for us.
So as a leader, how should I be? It's really interesting because this idea of the epiphany and then the decision, I can think of a particular decision that I made just recently.
Okay.
And it was something that I'd wrestled with for a long time. And then it was really weird. It was just this insight. It was just a little passing insight. And that was enough for me to make my decision.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so if someone is at the point, let's say, Kevin, where you were, where they've had that epiphany, but they're still teetering on the brink of the decision.
Right.
What are some recommendations that you might have for helping them to sort of tip over the edge and take the path that they know they should take?
Right. Well, first thing I'd say is the answer is usually much more clear than we're willing to admit. Usually we end up making decisions too late, not too early. And so, I'd say that one thing to keep in mind is the answer that you're seeking really crystal clear and you're just trying to deny it? I see that all the time. And because ultimately what we're dealing with here mostly is fear of what's on the other side.
Yes.
And the funny thing is, like, the other side is almost never remotely as scary as we imagine it to be in terms of risk and that sort of thing. In fact, it's almost always better. You talk to anybody who's made a big life change or life decision, and, within reason, most of them end up saying, best decision I ever made, right?
Yep.
Especially if it relates to improving your lifestyle. Because, look, a lot of these old cliches and adages like money can't buy happiness, they're cliche for a reason. And it's because they're true.
Right.
So let's be real honest. We tend to, especially in the context of our career, what holds us back, the fear that holds us back is financial security.
Yes.
And of course you have to be smart with your money, but, usually if you're rational about it, the risk is incredibly low if you're smart. Now, how can you get help thinking through these things? Mentors and talking to other people. I always say, and this is a huge thing for young people, is find someone who is what you want to be. it's so funny. Like there's so many, especially on Twitter and social media, there's so many like loudmouths who are self-professed experts in everything.
You're right.
But they don't have the credentials. Like they haven't done what they're talking about. And so I always say like, find someone who has their credentials, who actually has done what you want to do, who is what you want to be in all arenas of life, whether it's health, money, career, whatever, and do what they do or listen to what they say.
How does this idea of fear, I think, is really interesting. How has rock climbing helped you to negotiate those fear demons, so to speak, in your life?
Yeah. So it's funny you mentioned that because I just posted a thread yesterday that was basically saying it made the claim that in the world of sport, rock climbing is the single best metaphor for life. And the reason for that is it's a microcosm of so much of what we deal with in life. And also rock climbing itself is so multidimensional. I always say like to be a good rock climber, you have to be much more than just a strong person or have strong hands or whatever. You have to be smart. You have to be flexible. You have to have endurance. You have to be strategic. So you have to have intellect. All these things go into it. And so, like people probably get tired of me doing this, but there's always like anything in life, there's probably a metaphor in climbing, including fear management, because in climbing in a very real sense, you're managing risk, like life or death type risk.
Yes.
And so, if you were trying to eliminate the risk completely, you'd never climb. But of course, I love climbing, so I climb. So it's all about how do I manage that fear? That's the whole trick in life, is not ignoring it or acting like it doesn't exist or completely avoiding it, but managing it and being rational. I think.
How do you manage fear? Tell me how you do it personally.
Yeah. So I think there's someone in climbing, to kind of use one of the metaphors, someone in climbing told me a useful tool is to separate rational fear from irrational fear. And I'll give you a great example in climbing.
Please.
So in climbing, a lot of times there is absolute rational reason to be scared, right? So if I'm climbing up something and it's one of those situations where if I fall, I'm going to tumble to the ground and get injured, that's rational. But there's a lot of other situations, let's say where you're really high up on a wall and you're on a really exposed place and it feels scary, but the reality is you're secured with a rope. That's irrational fear. And so I think you can have a deliberate process whereby you recognize and separate out rational from irrational fear, and definitely heed the rational fear. That's legit risk and danger, but push the irrational fear away.
How do you push the irrational fear away?
Well, I think naming it is the start. It's like recognizing it for what it is. Because what happens is in the moment, irrational fear feels like rational fear. It feels the same as legitimate danger. But if you step back just for a moment and literally categorize it and say, okay, that's silly. I understand why I'm scared, but that's not something I need to be afraid of. It really helps you push through. I mean, that's exactly how climbers do it. Like when I'm in a scary situation, I can even calm myself down pretty quickly by recognizing, okay, actually, let me just step back for a minute. It's actually not a bad situation.
Right. Do you have any experience helping your children with this irrational, rational fear dynamic?
Well, that's a great question. And, anybody that claims to have parenting figured out is lying.
I believe you 100%. I got 5 kids and I know I don't have it figured out. If you have anything, I'm just
no. So the best you can do is give your best tips and I give my best tips and hopefully there's something in there. I would just say, sort of related to this is one thing that my wife and I jokingly refer to ourselves as our parenting style is the selfish parents style of parenting, because we like to live our own lives in addition to our life with the kids. And so as a result, we sort of have been kind of hands off. And we see a lot of our friends who are incredibly hands-on, the classic helicopter parents. And I don't like what I see. It's not that we were like smart or knew what we were doing. We're just selfish. And therefore we left our kids to fend for themselves a lot. And my 2 girls are now 15 and 17. And actually, I'm really proud that we've done that because now I see how they function like adults. They think like adults. And even in simple situations, like one thing that I did recently is I went to a concert in Las Vegas with my 17-year-old.
Metallica, right?
That's right. Metallica. It was amazing. And she leads the whole travel experience. So when we're in the airport, I'm not leading her through the airport she leads me now because she's done it. And the reason is because we never coddled them. We never did it for them. And so they've become very good at fending for themselves.
That's excellent. I appreciate that. So I really appreciate your insights here, Kevin. I do want to kind of summarize this because I do know that, as we get into our late 30s, 40s, 50s, we get these opportunities of the midlife crisis kind of epiphanies. And what we do with them can be positive or negative. Let's say we don't act on it, then we can become despairing, or perhaps we act incorrectly and, end up doing things that are destructive. You've made a choice that, as you look back on it, was a positive one for you. What would be 2 or 3 things that you would encourage people who are in that epiphany moment to do as next steps in terms of taking action?
Yeah. And by the way, I'm glad you brought up like the destructive side of these, call it midlife awakening crisis, whatever, because that's definitely the risk. It can go one way or the other. And I'd be lying if I didn't say I started to go down a bit of a destructive path. That was actually one of the motivators for me. Like, I need to make change. Like, I'm in a crisis here.
Yes.
I need to make change. I think this is a great insight for your listeners to take away is when people talk about midlife crisis, most people think of it as, oh, well, Eric, all of a sudden he just changed. He became a different person. And the philosopher Carl Jung would say it's exactly the opposite. What happens in a midlife crisis is the masks come off and you become your true self.
Yeah.
And all these masks you've been wearing to be successful in business, to be a good family man, they start to come off around midlife, and you're not changing. You're becoming who you really are. Recognizing that, and so you don't fight it, you embrace it, is as a great tool. So really digging in, and of course, it always helps to get professional help. The other thing I'd say is like a lot of people who are around going through this also find themselves like they've kind of lost their physical health a little bit. They're not fit.
Yes.
That's a great place to start, Eric, is if you find yourself like struggling a little bit, start by getting yourself in excellent shape. And you'll be amazed how it's like the rising tide that floats all boats. Everything becomes better. Your path becomes clearer. Without even trying, you'll find these other dimensions of your life that you really enjoy. I have a great story related to that. So one of my good friends who co-founded a business with me, he still runs the business. He had a midlife crisis, ended up getting divorced. It was kind of nasty. And he said, you know what? I'm just going to go back to some things I loved as a child. And so he lost, his fitness wasn't great. As a child, he was a BMX racer.
Oh, nice.
So he found that there's these adult BMX leagues that he joined. And he said, Kevin, it has transformed my life. Like, I met a whole community of people who I love hanging out with. I travel on weekends with them. I'm in the best shape I've been in 15 years. So just those little things can make a huge difference in your life.
I think it's interesting, that idea of masks, because, as you go through this midlife crisis and perhaps you're beginning to remove the masks, one of the decisions that you have to make is, at what point are you going to stop removing the mask? Because perhaps you go destructive because you have a particular mask on, and behind that is your best self, but you haven't quite got to that point yet. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, Carl Jung, the philosopher who kind of came up with that concept, would say, removing the mask isn't a choice. They're coming off at some point, whether it's when you're 40, 50, 60, whatever. And the later they come off, the worse it is in terms of doing something destructive. So I think if you want to be strategic about it, you recognize this early on and you actively sort of in a controlled way remove the mask and become the person you really are. And like, I always use the example, like when I had that epiphany, I looked around and I realized not only that boardroom was a place I didn't want to be, but also like I had this life that we had built that wasn't even representative of who I am. Like, we lived in this concrete jungle suburb. I've always been an outdoor guy, fishing and climbing and things like that. I lived in this like concrete jungle in this like McMansion with, like all these things that looked nice on paper, but had nothing to do with the real me. If you're strategic about it, you can kind of keep from having to blow everything up at once.
Yeah. See, that's interesting, isn't it? Because you can have the epiphany, but then there's some choices that you can make right away that are rather radical. But there's other choices that may take more time and more consideration.
Yeah. And, you just reminded me, I always joke with my friends and they agree, because if they know me, it's like, I like to blow shit up. So I will tend to make more radical changes, and I have to actually check myself on that a little bit. And the reason for that is because the environment I grew up in, like, I get nervous when things are going well. Like, I'm always waiting for the other shoe to drop. And so I'll blow things up proactively before they blow up on me.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. I really appreciate your time here, Kevin. I've enjoyed this. So I've got to ask this question. Would you free solo Half Dome?
Well, I'm a pretty good climber, but I'm certainly not on that level. And the answer is no. The risk involved there, that's a rational risk. That's not irrational risk. And, when your chances of dying are into double-digit percentages, that's probably where I draw the line.
No, I understand. Do you know Alex, by the way?
I've met him a couple of times. Yeah. I don't know him. I wouldn't consider him a friend.
Right.
But I always tell people, if you watch the movie Free Solo, which is what Eric's talking about.
It's a great movie.
It's a great movie. It won the Oscar for the best documentary. As scary as that looks to non-climbers, if you're a climber, it's even scarier because some of us have actually been on that wall and know what those moves feel like and how hard they are. And it's insane. And, but a mind-blowing achievement for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know they did a little bit of work around what's actually going on in Alex's brain and how he's able to process that fear. But it's just interesting. I found that so fascinating, the movie fascinating. And so I had to ask you because I know you love climbing.
Well, I think what you're getting at is I like to study extreme people because there's things to be learned from people at the extremes.
Yeah.
So almost all the biographies I read a lot of biographies. Almost all of them are of really extreme personalities. I'm reading the biography of Steve Wynn, the casino guy.
Yeah.
Right now. And, these are not people who are normal people. Right. They're extreme, but there's a lot to be learned from them.
That's great. Okay. So then that's a good place to end our interview here. You've got the Steve Wynn biography. Give me one or two other biographies that you would recommend people to read.
Oh, man. Well, right off the top of my head, the Steve Jobs, Walter Isaacson's
that's a great one.
Biography of Steve Jobs, another extreme personality. One that comes to mind, just for whatever reason also is Lance Armstrong's autobiography. I think he actually had 2 out, even though his life kind of blew up on him. And I don't think he's necessarily like a person I want to emulate.
Yep.
I actually found them really insightful because you'll see a little bit of yourself in these extreme people. And a lot of times it's a cautionary tale.
Yes. Excellent. Excellent. Well, I really appreciate your time, Kevin. We will put links into the show notes to swell.com if anyone's interested in checking that out. Did I get the URL right?
Yeah, it's swellmoney.com. And I encourage everybody to go sign up for our community. We haven't launched the product yet, but I think you're going to like it when you see it.
Excellent. And particularly for the younger folks in people's lives, that's something that would be a nice tool in terms of getting hold of your finances and those kinds of things at an early age.
That's right.
Beautiful. Well, Kevin, I've really enjoyed having you on. Thank you for connecting with some rando guy on Twitter and coming on the podcast. It's been tremendous having you, and thanks for the discussion.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate you not exposing my absolute lack of knowledge about anything related to construction.
You have plenty of knowledge about life, and I know that's been the most helpful thing, and I really appreciate it.
Cool. Thanks, Eric.
Hi, it's Eric. Just before you jet off, I want to remind you to connect with Kevin on Twitter at Camp4. He's got lots of great insights that I know you'll benefit from. And if you like this interview, share it with other people in your network. And I hope you've had some things to think about as we've considered Kevin's story, Kevin's insights. And I want to encourage you to make sure that your life truly is well balanced. There is an old saying that I know you know: naked we came into the world, and naked we are going to leave. You're not going to take your money with you. So think about the choices that you're making today in terms of how you're spending your time and whom you're spending your time with and where you are spending your time. And ask yourself, is this a reflection of my highest and best self? Again, thanks for listening to Construction Genius. Have a terrific day.